The clues gathered at a homicide challenge investigators' preconceptions. The evidence now compels them to search for the killer in the last place they'd think to look. An unidentified body is abandoned on a Texas freeway. Investigators have miles to go before they gather enough clues to nail her killer. A young woman disappears. Detectives must weave a missing persons case around a tattered shirt and a shard of plastic. Big crimes are often solved by the smallest clues. Every criminal takes something away from the crime scene and leaves something behind. Forensics is the science of building a case by reading each remnant of blame. Northeast of Atlanta sits the city of Sugar Hill, Georgia. It's a little city of about 5,000 people, but it found itself in the midst of a big city problem. On the morning of April 16, 1993, a garage owner found a car abandoned in his parking lot. When he looked inside, he discovered a terrible crime. The body of a woman was slumped in the driver's seat, dead. Officers of the Gwinnett County Police Department responded to the scene. From the position of her body and the direction of the blood spatter, it was clear the woman had been shot in the head. Her purse was not in the car. Police could find no identification, nor did they have a suspect. But the evidence did point to a motive. Assistant Police Chief John Latty believed this was a carjacking gone wrong.
The ignition was on, but the engine was off, gas in the tank. She had power windows, and her window was rolled down, but she was seat belted in the car.
In a random crime like carjacking, the perpetrator leaves few clues. Police didn't even know where to begin. All that changed with the arrival of a man named Michael Thompson. Driving by the scene, he noticed the commotion. Then he saw the car. It looked like his mother's. To Latty, Thompson's arrival was too much of a coincidence.
We were interested in him due to the fact that he showed up at the scene about the time we did. Also, he had a shady past. He had a criminal history, was a suspected drug user, and so therefore the preliminary suspicion fell on him.
Michael Thompson confirmed what the vehicle registration had indicated. The victim was his mother, Emma Jean Thompson, age 53. When police checked into Thompson's background, they learned that his mother had called police in early April to report a burglary. Gwinnett County police officer Michael Chappell responded to that call. He was told that $7 of the $15,000 the victim kept taped to the back of her dresser had been stolen. Michael Thompson didn't know it, but Emma Jean had told Chappell she thought her son might have stolen the money. She was banking on Officer Chappell to catch the burglar and, if possible, find her money.
She actually showed him, upon his request, the remainder of the money, which was we estimate to be in the neighborhood of $7,000. And all the money was in new $100 bills.
Officer Chappell assured the victim that the money would be easy to find because it was in consecutively numbered, brand new bills. After the murder of Emma Jean Thompson, police discovered that the rest of the cash was missing from its unusual hiding place. They believed Thompson might have killed his mother for the money. They would just have to prove it. The autopsy revealed that the victim had been shot twice in the head at close range with a large caliber weapon. Someone in the area must have heard the shots. Police set up roadblocks to question drivers about what they remembered from the night before. They found an unusual number of potential witnesses. Emma Jean Thompson had been murdered on April 15th. Traffic driving past the murder scene on the way to the nearby post office had been heavy.
Many of them remembered it because it was tax day, and they said, we observed a vehicle sitting behind the victim's vehicle. All of them said it appeared to be a police vehicle. That not only was it a patrol car, but it was one of Gwinnett County police patrol cars, and that it was a specific type and design of a police car, so we were able to determine that it was one of ours.
Witnesses pinpointed the police car at the murder scene between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. Many said it looked as if the victim's car had been pulled over. This disturbing revelation steered suspicion away from the victim's son. As more witnesses came forward, police had to consider the awful possibility that the killer was one of their own. The investigation began within the department. Detectives were aware that Officer Michael Chappell had responded to the victim's burglary complaint 2 weeks earlier. When Chief Latty looked for Chappell's report on the case, he couldn't find it. Chappell was asked about it.
This is okay. If you go ahead and file it.
His reason for not filing a report on the burglary seemed credible.
Of course, he had explanations that he thought it was a BS case and that he didn't want to bother with writing a report. So I instructed him to gather all the information from that time and to write a report.
While Chappell prepared the belated report, detectives interviewed the victim's friends.
How you doing? I'm Detective Smith.
They said Emma Jean Thompson had been touched by Officer Chappell's personal interest in her burglary case.
During the course of having these conversations with her friends, she also told her friends that Officer Chappell was concerned about her and was keeping an eye on her, and that she had observed him following her on several occasions. She believed that he was concerned about her and was looking out for her.
To detectives, it was beginning to look as though this guardian angel may have had only his own interests at heart. But they had no evidence to support this theory. Chappell had an alibi for the time of the murder. He said he went to the firehouse to watch TV between 8 and 10:30 p.m. Interviews at the firehouse, however, did not allay suspicion. His friends agreed Chappell was present on the night of the 15th, but no one could agree about when he left. Chappell's alibi was shaky. He still might have had the opportunity to commit the crime. A background check revealed a possible motive. Before the murder, Chappell had been heavily in debt. After the murder, his creditors told police he paid off what he owed with crisp $100 bills. But this would never be enough to convict one of Gwinnett County's finest. Detectives needed more proof before they could make an arrest. They had to be absolutely certain. Investigators soon learned the victim may have met her death by appointment.
We did an interview with one of the victim's close friends who told us that she had a conversation with the victim, and the victim had reported that she was to meet with Officer Chappell that night, and that he'd instructed her to bring her money because he'd recovered some of her money and could compare serial numbers and hopefully recover some for her. I don't envy them that task.
1 week after the crime, Officer Chappell was called in for a second round of questioning.
If I'd ever had the slightest thought that I'd be sitting here tonight talking to you about a murder, I'd have stayed out there.
Chief Latty talked with Chappell in the police station for hours, hoping he could give them some information that would point the blame elsewhere. He could not.
There are no other suspects at this point.
It was during the course of the interview, probably about 2 hours into the interview, that Investigator Burnett came into the room and informed him that he was being charged with this crime.
Chappell became an enemy of the law he had sworn to uphold.
He reacted by slumping, sighing, and began to talk about the fact that he knew there was no bond for a murder charge, an armed robbery charge, and he'd probably be in jail for a long time before he could prove his innocence.
That is overwhelming evidence. All I've got is what I know happened, and that's not going to do me any good. I have no alibi. I have nothing.
Nothing would make Latty happier than if Chappell could prove he was innocent. But friendship must take a back seat to justice. The chief knew what he had to do. Chappell was relieved of duty and told to turn in his gun and his badge. It was important to treat this case like any other. Only the evidence could prove whether or not Chappell pulled the trigger. Did Officer Michael Chappell kill Emma Jean Thompson in cold blood? To find out, search warrants were executed for his locker and the trunk of his patrol car. Chappell's belongings were entered as evidence and examined closely. His raincoat was sent to the lab and tested for any kind of trace evidence. Tests for minuscule amounts of blood were positive. The stains were shaped like high-velocity blood spatter. When a bullet strikes a body, the impact creates a fine mist of fluids that often blows back toward the weapon and the shooter. While the blood was being analyzed, detectives received another lead from a sharp-eyed car wash manager.
Officer Chappell had been into the car wash on the day that we had discovered the victim's body, and that he'd had his car detailed, his patrol car. Also that he had paid her with a new $100 bill for the work on the car.
His patrol car was brought to the crime lab and examined for potential evidence the detailers might have missed. An adhesive strip was used to lift any hair or fibers left by the victim. One stain on the upholstery warranted closer inspection. Jennifer Archer of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Serology and DNA Unit was given a head start on her work.
When I received the call from Gwinnett County Police Department, they indicated to me that they had performed a field test called luminol. This test showed them that there was a possibility that there was a blood stain on the armrest of the car seat of the patrol car.
Archer tested a swatch from the armrest to see if the stain was truly blood. She dabbed the cloth with 2 moistened cotton swabs. Each swab was then treated with a different chemical. Both swabs changed color, confirming the presence of blood. Was the blood human? Scientists had a test for that, too. A drop of the unknown blood was added to a sample of human antiserum, an enzyme that reacts with proteins found only in human blood. Gravity pulls the blood through the antiserum. If the blood is human, a white line appears. The blood in the police car and on the raincoat was human. Only the results of a DNA comparison could definitely link the bloodstains to the victim, Emma Jean Thompson. The blood was placed in a gel medium and subjected to an RFLP test. In this process, mild electrical current separates the longer and shorter fragments of DNA into a banding pattern unique to the donor. Upon inspection, the patterns in the victim's DNA resembled the sample taken from the cruiser's armrest. Computer analysis statistically confirmed the match. No more than 1 in 10 billion people would share these patterns. Detectives had forged an unbroken chain of evidence between Chappell's coat, his vehicle, and the blood of Emma Jean Thompson. The lab confirmed the grim reality. One of Gwinnett County's cops was a killer. With the forensic evidence in place, events leading up to the murder became clear. On April 15th, Chappell arranged to meet his victim to rob her of the money the burglar had left behind. When the victim opened her purse, Chappell opened fire. Most of the incriminating blood evidence on the coat and in the patrol car was barely visible to the naked eye. But forensic science brought the remnants of the crime into sharp relief in court.
The one key piece of evidence was the DNA evidence. There's no question about that. It's such powerful evidence. And the fact that there was probably some very serious doubt in the minds of a lot of people that Officer Chappell could have or would have committed this crime. And so it took some kind of profound or solid physical evidence to link him to the victim's blood.
As always, the ultimate test of the forensic evidence took place in the jury box. After 18 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict against Michael Chappell. But he received more mercy than he had shown his victim. He was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years in prison, the stiffest penalty allowed by Georgia law, short of a death sentence. Chappell disguised his crime to look like a failed carjacking. Other killers try to hide their crimes by disposing of the body. The roads leading to Houston are kept as beautiful as the city itself. But on March 27, 1992, a litter crew on a freeway outside of town made an ugly discovery.
You got a TV? Anybody need a TV? Go ahead. Hey, let's see it.
The cardboard box seemed ordinary at first.
Get this stuff. Let's do it.
But when they pulled back the flaps, they found themselves staring into a makeshift coffin. Within lay the dismembered remains of a human being. The Houston Police Department's Homicide Division dispatched a forensics unit to the scene. Technicians scoured the roadside for evidence. The victim had been dead several hours. Dismembering the body would have spilled up to 12 pints of blood. But not a drop of blood or any other clue was discovered in the vicinity. Sergeant Mike Peters believed most of the forensic evidence lay elsewhere.
Well, the conclusion that we came to is that this wasn't the actual crime scene. This is just a place where the victim had been placed by the suspect after the crime occurred.
Police had to rely on the box's contents for leads to the killer. Besides the body, it didn't contain much. Just an old blue blanket. In the crime lab, investigators tried to identify the victim. But all they had was the torso. And beneath it, the victim's right arm. police had to depend on partial remains to tell the full story. They determined the victim was a woman in her early 20s. The autopsy revealed she was pregnant. Investigators tried to match her fingerprints, but they weren't on file. Sergeant Peters hoped to have better luck with the missing persons reports. Only the night before, police had received a call from a man named Oscar Reyes. He said his wife, Cecilia, hadn't come home from her job at a liquor store. Police found Reyes and his wife's co-worker making missing persons flyers to post in the neighborhood. Oscar Reyes was able to identify his wife's torso from a surgical scar on her neck. His wife had been found, but her killer was still at large.
Monday morning of last week.
What's the make and model on it, do you know?
Investigators had to consider the possibility that Oscar Reyes had murdered his wife. Detectives interviewed him and checked his home for signs of foul play. If Cecilia Reyes had been murdered here, they would have found a large quantity of blood. None was detected. With Oscar Reyes off the suspects list, the investigators had to find other leads.
Hey, how you doing?
They went to the store where Cecilia worked.
Ask you a few questions.
Her manager said that she was last seen the night before as she headed home. Her co-workers described her as a cheerful, open-hearted woman with no known enemies. But she did have an unwanted admirer. A man named Gerardo Marquez occasionally hung around the store. They said he enjoyed flirting with the women, especially Cecilia. He often brought her presents, though she asked him not to. He seemed strange, but harmless enough.
Right here, my bad.
Police paid a visit to Gerardo Marquez, who lived a few miles from the liquor store. He was a 36-year-old part-time fence builder who had a girlfriend. He was distressed to learn of the death of Cecilia Reyes. He hardly seemed like the kind of monster capable of killing and dismembering someone. He didn't hesitate to allow police to search his apartment. When asked about the scratches on his face, Marquez told police he'd cut himself while climbing a fence. His explanations seemed entirely plausible. His manner was completely disarming. Then, traces of blood were found in his bathroom sink. Marquez said he cut himself. Detectives reasoned that if a body had been dismembered here, much more blood would have been spilled. The killer's identity and the original crime scene remained a mystery. At the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, technicians looked for clues they hoped would lead to other suspects. They traced the box to a manufacturer in the same neighborhood as Marquez, but there the trail grew cold. Attention focused on the blanket that had been the victim's shroud. Though free of blood, it might conceal other clues. Hair, fibers, and other easy-to-miss trace evidence are often more revealing than a conspicuous bloodstain. Criminalist Raiden Hillman examined it.
There were several areas that looked like stains, but they were in a particular pattern that indicated that maybe a piece of furniture had been sat down on top of the blanket and refinished or painted on top of it.
She measured the pattern of the dark stains. The legs of the furniture that had rested on the blanket formed a rectangle 14 inches wide by 25 inches long. While taking the measurements, she also noted minute feathers lodged in the weave of the blanket. She sent them for analysis.
And you
In a
have
case
no
with
idea
few
what
leads,
that you're
detectives made the most of what they had. They asked Marquez's girlfriend to come to the police station for more questioning. She mentioned that Marquez did own a blue blanket stained with paint.
It was under the dresser.
She hadn't seen it recently. The blanket seemed to link Marquez to the crime, but detectives had to be sure it was the same blanket the girlfriend had spoken of. The distance between the paint spots would provide the answer.
So armed with these measurements, Sergeant Stevens, Shirley, and myself went out to Marquez's house and measured the post legs on the base of the bureau, and they exactly measured the markings on the blanket.
The dark stains on the blanket matched the dimensions of Marquez's bureau. Next, Hillman had to be certain that the stains came from the bureau. Following the trail of trace evidence, she reasoned that if the bureau left its mark on the blanket, then the blanket must have left its traces on the bureau.
There would be fibers from the blanket stuck on the bottom of the furniture and at least tie the blanket back to the place where the murder had occurred.
Hillman's theory about the fibers was soon proved true. Investigators found tiny blue filaments stuck to the tips of the dresser legs. With the fibers and the bureau legs, investigators began to build a case against Gerardo Marquez. To make the link between the victim and Marquez's apartment ironclad, Hillman used an infrared spectrometer to compare the paint on the blanket with the paint on the bureau.
All right, we're going to try to match up to some paint that was found in the apartment.
Spectrometer shines infrared light on the sample, which absorbs and reflects it in certain ways, producing a spectrum. The apparatus then measures how the sample absorbs the light and displays the measurements as a series of peaks and valleys. Every substance has its own unique spectroscopic fingerprint.
In looking at the total spectrum, we can see what type of paint it is, and also we would compare the known sample, as this is, to any unknown samples.
The spectra from the paint on the bureau and from the paint on the blanket lined up. The paint matched.
So you already measured this?
Hillman and Sergeant Peters compared the fibers on the dresser leg with the fabric of the blanket. Once again, the two samples had come from the same source, Marquez's apartment.
He had some questions to answer about why this blanket that was obviously affiliated with the victim was now affiliated with his apartment also.
Based on the information from the lab, detectives now believed they had found their man. They returned to Marquez's home. He remained cooperative and made it clear that he was eager for police to solve the case. He admitted that the blanket was his, but after using it as a drop cloth, he said he tossed it into a dumpster. The real killer must have retrieved it to wrap the body. The explanation was convenient and irrefutable. But investigators still had work to do. They re-examined his bathroom using glucomalachite, a chemical that makes traces of blood glow. It illuminated blood on the shower curtain. These stains could not have been the result of a minor cut. But again, Marquez had an easy explanation. He disclosed that he slaughtered his own chickens in the bathtub.
Oh, that's where I keep the chickens. Yeah, you don't know.
The freezer contained the proof and the likely source of the feathers Hillman found on the blanket. While they were in the kitchen, Marquez offered investigators some refreshments. Gerardo Marquez was acting like a man who was either completely innocent or totally cold-blooded. As police searched for the killer of Cecilia Reyes, they pinned their hopes on the blood evidence recovered from the apartment of Gerardo Marquez. Marquez had told police that the blood found on his shower curtain was chicken blood. The lab would determine if Marquez was telling the truth. swabs of the blood were tested with human anti-serum. It reacted, proving the blood on the shower curtain was shed by a human, not a chicken. But investigators didn't find enough blood to do a complete battery of tests, and not enough to indicate that a murder took place here. However, there was enough blood and enough questions to warrant another visit to Marquez. Technicians arrived to pull up the floor tiles in his bathroom. The room had been thoroughly scrubbed, but the evidence remained just below the surface.
All right, this is marked. It was obvious that there had been, at one point, quite a bit. There was enough that had soaked down underneath the floor tiles.
Tests on the sample revealed it was type O. Both Marquez and his girlfriend had given blood samples, and neither had that type. But Cecilia Reyes did. She had been here. She had died here. Based on the forensic evidence, Gerardo Marquez was arrested and charged with the murder of Cecilia Reyes. When presented with the evidence amassed against him, he said that while his girlfriend was out, Reyes had voluntarily come to his apartment. They argued, and she fell, struck her head, and died. In a panic, he had disposed of the body, fearing no one would believe his story. Investigators told Marquez that in order to believe him, they needed to examine the rest of the body to confirm the cause of death.
Where is it? Right here?
Cooperative as ever, Marquez led police to a field on the outskirts of Houston.
Do this. Yeah, right.
There, abandoned in 2 more corrugated boxes, was the balance of the victim's remains.
Go ahead and radio this.
7825, code 6, 105 North Avenue, 52.
An autopsy revealed a bruise on the victim's head, supporting Marquez's story. Then, medical examiners found a deep knife wound in her throat. The stab wound was above the area where the victim had been dismembered and appeared to have been made by a different type of blade. That suggested the wound had been inflicted prior to the victim's death, and not during the gruesome dismemberment. Once again, the suspect was caught in a lie. Police pieced together what had probably happened on the victim's last night alive. Leaving work as usual, Cecilia Reyes was accosted by Marquez.
Hi.
He abducted her and brought her to his apartment. There, she rebuffed his sexual advances, inflicting the scratches detectives had seen on his face. During the struggle, he stabbed her to death. To expunge evidence that the victim had ever been at his home, Marquez dismembered her remains. Then he placed the body inside 3 cardboard boxes. In the dead of night, he abandoned the boxes miles from his apartment. Though the suspect's guilt was ultimately written in blood, an ordinary blanket propelled the investigation. Gerardo Marquez was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Often, the most grisly murders are solved with the most mundane clues. The trick is knowing where to look and how to use them. Most homicide cases start with a body. This one began with a chance observation: a torn shirt half hidden in the grass, and a dark stain in the road that might be blood. When Officer Kenny Corcoran noticed them soon after breakfast one Sunday outside his house on Smiling Acres Road in Tangipahoa Parish, Louisiana, he knew just what to do. Call Detective Chester Pritchett.
It's all right. Tell you what I got, Chester. I got blood in the road here. You see the mark of the car.
As soon as he arrived, Pritchett wanted to see what Corcoran had found. There was a stain in the road, Corcoran explained, most likely blood from a deer or a dog hit by a passing car. The torn shirt was a little harder to explain. Both men agreed they should dig into this a little deeper.
Well, I want to do it. I will. You hear something, let me know, right?
Pritchett was known as a careful police officer. Before leaving home that Sunday morning, he had checked to see whether any accidents or missing persons had been reported. None had. Only on Tuesday did he learn of a young woman's disappearance. On the wall of the courthouse, Pritchett found a poster of a missing girl. Rebecca Forbes, a 19-year-old high school student who vanished a mere 48 hours earlier. She was wearing a white shirt, which seemed to match the one he found on Sunday.
I'm going to have to go talk to the family, get a better picture, get an idea what she was wearing.
For Pritchett, her disappearance and the discovery of the torn shirt were sufficient grounds to begin an investigation. 6:30 p.m., Saturday, April 28, 1990. At her home in Dedham, Louisiana, Rebecca Forbes prepared for a night out at the Italian Festival in nearby Independence.
Bye, Mom.
It was the last time Virginia Forbes would see her daughter alive. At the festival, Rebecca met a young man. They talked and danced and were still together when Rebecca's friends lost track of her. None of them remembered hearing his name, but with the help of police records, Pritchett hoped they still might identify him. From police files, one of Rebecca Forbes' friends picked out the man's face. His name was Kelly Trott. Just 20 years old, he was well known as a troublemaker. He had been arrested more than once for house break-ins. In time, Pritchett would interview Trott to check his version of events at the festival. Before that, he hoped to have a report on the shirt Kenny Corcoran had found. At Louisiana State Crime Laboratory, Pritchett had given the shirt to forensic scientists George Skiro and Pat Lane. He asked them to learn all they could from it. Skiro's examination began with the physical state of the shirt. He scrutinized it for what is called trace evidence: hair, fibers, material of any kind adhering to it. Next, the most basic question: were the dark stains really blood? To determine that, Skiro conducted a cascade of chemical tests, designed successively to confirm or eliminate the presence of blood. First, a cotton swab was moistened with distilled water. Blood dissolves in water, turning the tip of the swab brown. Then, a reagent called phenolphthalein was added. Now, if blood was present, the brown stain would turn green. Next, a drop of hydrogen peroxide. Blood products produce an intense pink color. Finally, Skiro carried out a test to confirm his diagnosis.
Okay.
Adding another chemical, he looked for red crystals of hemochromogen, a chemical complex formed only in the presence of blood.
And this is the final step in proving that substance is blood. It's not species specific, this particular test. It just tells us that blood is present.
For Skiro, this was just the beginning. He would schedule further, more elaborate tests. Was it human blood he had found, or that of some animal? And if it was human, whose was it? Getting answers would grow more urgent as the investigation progressed. Meanwhile, Pritchett returned to Smiling Acres Road, which he had declared a crime scene. Inch by inch, his men scoured the ground, collecting anything, however insignificant, that could be a clue.
We recovered cigarette butts, There's a possibility of saliva off the cigarette butts, maybe assistance. We've got a couple beer cans and bottle that could yield the same thing.
And there was this, a tiny piece of clear plastic.
I'm going to submit that, all these other items to the crime lab, just to see if they can do something with them.
Do we make it a good
Was the fragment of plastic just roadside litter, or was it a clue? Several more weeks would pass before its true significance emerged.
I think we got some good information.
On Friday, May 4th, 6 days after Rebecca Forbes' disappearance, Detective Chester Pritchett finally caught up with suspect Kelly Drott. Did he simply have a brief encounter with Rebecca? Or did he know more than he was prepared to say? Drott admitted to meeting Rebecca. She bummed a cigarette from him. They danced. At around 10 o'clock, she disappeared into the crowd, and that was the last Drott saw of her, he said. Casual charmer or not, Kelly Drott's story began crumbling as soon as investigators examined his car.
In the trunk, there was no mat, no floor covering, and it had been pulled out, and there was water in the wheel well, which indicated to us he attempted to wash the car out. And on the hinges and under the tail light, we found splatters of what appears to be blood, tiny specks, a lot of them. He says that it's deer blood, where he ran over a deer, put the deer in the trunk, and it was thrashing around. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Pritchett immediately ordered the suspect's car impounded. It too would be scrutinized by George Skiro and Pat Lane at the crime lab.
I'll look in the outer way places where, for instance, if someone tried to clean up blood, where would this blood go? Would it seep down behind the seat cushions? Would it go into the threads of the fabric? I'll look in all those areas. I'll look in the out of the way areas.
As the search continued, Skiro began noticing blood in places inconsistent with someone having hit a deer. Blood marred the inside of the door jambs and the light switch. Now the pressure was on. Skiro had to determine the source of the blood, from the blood-stained shirt and in Kelly Drott's car.
Okay, once we determined that there was human blood on the blouse and human blood in the trunk, the next step was to do an ABO blood type and try and determine what type blood it was. When we did the examination, we found out that both samples from the blouse and in the trunk of the car were type O blood.
The test was less conclusive than Skiro had hoped. Type O blood is the most common human blood group. Here, as it turned out, both the possible victim and the possible suspect possessed it.
So it did not provide any information of value. The next step was to send it off for DNA analysis to see if a more specific genetic profile could be built up on the bloods.
It would require several weeks for the DNA tests to be completed. Before that, the case would take a dramatic new turn. Sunday, May 19th, 3 weeks after Rebecca Forbes was last seen, two men hunting along the Tangipahoa River stumbled across a badly decomposed corpse.
Well, the way this case started was with a mystery. We had some bloody clothes found in the middle of the road. Next thing we know, we got a vehicle that has blood in it, allegedly deer blood, but we proved otherwise that it was human blood. And the final thing we needed to bring this case together was to find a body that we could link to all these different scenes.
Critical to connecting the elements of the Rebecca Forbes case was GeneScreen, one of the most sophisticated testing laboratories in the United States. The state crime lab had identified both Rebecca's and Kelly Drott's blood type. GeneScreen was charged with refining those analyses. In our cells, we each possess our own unique individual form of DNA. GeneScreen's expertise is in testing bodily tissue to reveal its DNA fingerprint. Blood from Kelly Drott's truck and from the blood-stained woman's shirt had already been sent to the lab. The lab also received material from Rebecca Forbes' badly decomposed body. GeneScreen director Bob Giles.
DNA is a very useful forensic tool. It's very useful because it's highly discriminatory at identifying individuals. In this particular case, it was very important because this is a case involving circumstantial evidence. And without the DNA testing, the investigators were not able to link the victim's blood to the suspect's car.
When the test results were in, they could not have been clearer, as gene screen scientist Judy Floyd explains.
What the DNA did tell us, in effect, was that the blood on the blouse was that of Rebecca Forbes, and we can say that with a high degree of certainty. The blood in the back of the car of Mr. Drott was also that, most likely, of Rebecca Forbes, the victim. What the DNA did not tell us was what actually took place that night, the chain of events that led to that tragic attack.
One final piece of evidence cemented the case against Kelly Drott. That odd-shaped piece of plastic found near the bloody shirt on Smiling Acres Road. It was a fragment of crystal from a watch. Rebecca Forbes had been wearing a wristwatch when her body was found at the river. The broken crystal certainly looked as if it came from Rebecca's watch. It fit snugly onto its face. But Lane needed more evidence to prove that the two parts belonged together. Along the edge of the crystal, he noticed a series of pits, places where tiny pieces had been left behind when the crystal had been smashed. Lane made a cast of the underside of the rim to prove that the patterns on the rim and the crystal matched.
Okay, the piece that we're looking at right now is going to be the microcell cast that was done of the watch face, more specifically the rim area where the glass crystal would actually have been glued into or onto the face of the watch.
Now Lane could make a detailed comparison between the nicks along the edge of the crystal and the tiny fragments of plastic still trapped under the watch rim.
That piece of crystal fit in with the little imperfection breaks that had stuck in the track along the margin of that and really turned out to be a very beautiful fracture match of that crystal.
With the final piece of evidence in place, the investigators were able to reconstruct what took place the night of the Italian festival. Rebecca had met Kelly and danced with him. Around midnight, he took her for a ride in his car. They stopped along Smiling Acres Road, where they argued. In a violent rage, Kelly Drott killed Rebecca Forbes.
The victim is dead, obviously, in this case. She can't talk. The suspect, even though he is talking, we don't know if he's being truthful or not. The physical evidence will not lie. It has the capability of telling us at a moment in time that a certain event took place. It may not necessarily tell us a whole sequence of events, but it allows us to at least pinpoint at one particular moment in time this event took place. That can then be weighed against the statements that have been made by suspect.
On May 23rd, just 4 days after the discovery of Rebecca's remains, Kelly Drott was arrested. Convicted of manslaughter, he was sentenced to 21 years in prison.
Well, Kelly worked on a construction crew at a local chicken processing plant, and he had a disagreement with one of his fellow employees that rides to work with him. He told the guy several days ago that if he didn't watch his mouth, he'd find himself in the river, just like that girl he had dumped in the river.
Evidence that can be seen by the naked eye is vital to solving a murder. But forensic science, coupled with rigorous investigative techniques, brings the smallest clues to light and brings more killers to justice. An unidentified body turns up in the woods of North Carolina. With no motive and no suspects, investigators struggle to find the killer. In California, a housewife is taken into custody. When no record of her arrest turns up, detectives begin to fear the worst. A tragic horse accident ends the life of a Montana woman.
Do that?
But examiners uncover the markings of murder. When a crime scene yields vague clues, detectives must piece together their case through other means. Forensic science has found ways to uncover motive, exposing those who kill for love or money. North Carolina's northwest corner is dominated by rugged terrain, its landscape untouched by the problems of city life. That was about to change. On January 7th, 1994, a Department of Transportation worker surveyed some land near a rural highway. He made a horrifying discovery. Investigators from the Watauga County Sheriff's Department were called to the scene. Hidden among the overgrowth, they found a body. Though the cool weather helped preserve the body, investigators determined he had been there for some time. The victim, a male in his 30s or 40s, had gunshot wounds on the left temple and right side of the neck. The body was completely nude, except for a watch and ring on his left hand. But other than the jewelry, there wasn't much evidence to identify the victim or tie him to his killer. Investigators scoured the scene around the body, searching for any scrap of evidence. A few feet from the body, they found a piece of black electrical tape. The single strand of tape was collected and sent to the crime lab for analysis. Captain Paula Townsend worked the case. Hoping to identify the John Doe, she entered what little information she had into the police database.
We knew that we did not have any outstanding missing persons in our county, so we would have to make some effort to locate a missing person from another area and determine his identity.
They didn't have to wait long. Later that evening, detectives got a call from police in nearby Salisbury. A man in their town had been reported missing several weeks before. He fit the description of the dead body found along the road. His name was Victor Gunnarsson. Salisbury police agreed to forward their case file. An autopsy showed that 2 bullets to the head had ended the victim's life. Analysis of the stomach showed the presence of undigested potatoes, eaten within 5 hours of his murder.
Thank you.
Townsend searched through Gunnarsson's case file, looking for any clue that could help her identify him as the victim. There was nothing conclusive. But if Gunnarsson was the victim, Townsend learned he had a sensational past.
Victor Gunnarsson was actually a Swedish national. He had come to the United States seeking political asylum because he had actually been criminally charged with assassinating the Prime Minister Olof Palme in Sweden a few years earlier.
Gunnarsson had been held as the primary suspect in the assassination, but was released when no witnesses could identify him as the killer. Watauga investigators were having a similar problem. To confirm that the body was his, investigators requested his fingerprints, which were on file at Interpol. A week after the body was found, the prints arrived in North Carolina. They matched. Now, police had to determine why someone wanted Victor Gunnarsson dead. His notorious past could not be ignored.
When we learned about what had happened to him in Sweden, we didn't know if it was related or not. We did have to consider that possibility that there was some political motivation in his death.
The small-town murder had huge international implications. But as investigators probed Gunnarson's final days, they learned he had other problems close to home. In January, having heard about the case on the news, a woman named Kay Whedon came forward to make a statement. She'd met Gunnarsson on Thanksgiving and had been out with him several times that week.
About 2 months ago.
But after their last date on December 3rd, she hadn't heard from him again.
Friend is dead.
That night, he'd taken her out to dinner. Whedon confirmed that Gunnarsson had eaten a baked potato at that time. Based on the autopsy results, investigators knew that this was his last meal. After dinner, Whedon invited him back to her place. But they were not alone. Whedon's ex-boyfriend, L.C. Underwood, and a friend named Shelley Thompson cruised by the house around 11 p.m. It wasn't a friendly visit. Kay Whedon described her stormy 2-year relationship with Underwood to police. Though they'd broken up, he refused to let her out of his life.
He had stalked her for some time. He was very jealous and obsessive. There were several incidents where he had confronted her when she was with another date. And the fact that he drove by on the night of December 3rd when Victor Gunnarsson was in her house caused him to be a suspect in this case.
The theory that Gunnarsson was the target of a political assassination was losing its credibility. L.C. Underwood's obsessive jealousy made him a prime suspect in the Swede's murder. But it wouldn't be an easy case to pursue. In addition to being a suspect, he was also a cop.
L.C. Underwood had been in law enforcement for 19 and a half years. He began his law enforcement career in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, and he later moved through a couple of other agencies before he finally moved to Salisbury, and he had been a police officer in Salisbury for about 8 years.
Pointing the finger at a police officer is tricky business. If investigators' suspicions about Underwood were wrong, they'd be destroying a colleague's professional and personal life. But if they were correct, they'd be fighting an uphill battle against someone who knew how to hide evidence. To make their case, investigators would have to stay one step ahead of Underwood. Instead of confronting him directly, detectives began by questioning the people around him. Shelley Thompson had been in the car when the suspect drove by Whedon's house. Underwood had told her that he was doing a favor for a friend when he drove by and jotted down Gunnarsson's license plate number. Thompson said that when they returned to his house, he called the station and asked a colleague to run the plates.
Had you had any contact?
Investigators confirmed that Underwood was given Gunnarsson's name and address that night.
Do you have the time to do that now?
The information was enough for police to obtain a warrant to search Underwood's home. They were about to confront a fellow police officer, the prime suspect in their murder investigation. As they searched his house, investigators asked Underwood what he knew about Victor Gunnarsson's murder. Not only did Underwood deny any knowledge of the crime, he claimed he'd never even heard the name before. The suspect had just been caught in a lie. But that didn't prove murder. Investigators needed solid physical evidence to connect him to the crime. The initial search of the immaculate home contributed nothing to the case. If Underwood had killed the Swede, he was too smart and too organized to leave a smoking gun. The only way to catch him would be to find less obvious clues in unexpected places. Behind the washing machine, they noticed something they had seen before. A piece of black electrical tape, like the one found near Victor Gunnarson's body. It appeared the meticulous cop had underestimated his colleague's determination. Watauga County, North Carolina police struggled to solve the murder of 38-year-old Victor Gunnarson. In the home of the prime suspect, police officer L.C. Underwood,
Here, come on back over here.
investigators found a critical piece of evidence, black electrical tape.
One particular piece of tape that was found on the back of Underwood's dryer in his utility room was consistent in several ways with the tape that was found at the crime scene near Victor Gunnarson's body.
The unlikely clue was turned over to the Trace Evidence Department at the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Technicians compared the sample with the tape found at the crime scene. Trace evidence expert Troy Hamlin studied and compared the characteristics of the two samples.
The physical dimensions were compared, the width, the thickness, the composition was also compared, which were inorganic and organic characteristics. All of these were consistent with one another, and therefore those two items of evidence could have originated from the same roll of tape.
It was a key finding, but the case against Underwood couldn't be made on the tape evidence alone. Detectives needed something to physically link the suspect directly to the victim. They obtained a warrant to search his car.
Right there.
But like his house, the vehicle was impeccably clean. Even the trunk was spotless. Still, investigators refused to simply walk away. The trunk liner was removed and sent to the lab for closer analysis. That, too, would be a struggle. The liner had been recently washed and vacuumed, removing a great deal of trace evidence in the process. Using sticky tape, examiner Troy Hamlin went over every square inch of the liner, searching for any microscopic clue that survived the cleaning. He found nothing. The veteran police officer, it seemed, was getting away with murder. But then, Hamlin spotted a minuscule clue that could potentially have enormous value. He plucked a single hair root, barely visible to the naked eye. Probing more carefully at that area of the carpet, he was able to extract 17 more hairs, deeply embedded in the weave. Hairs collected from the victim and those found in the carpeting were mounted on slides and analyzed under a comparison microscope. The microscopic analysis showed that the hairs were physically indistinguishable. Detectives finally had the break they needed.
When I received a phone call from the lab analyst who told me that he had found the head hair in Underwood's trunk mat that was consistent with Victor Gunnarson's, I was ecstatic.
But if their entire physical case was going to hang by this microscopic evidence, investigators needed irrefutable proof. Examiners determined that the hair contained enough material for a DNA analysis. The tests confirmed that the DNA sequence from the hair found in the trunk of the suspect's vehicle was the same as the DNA sequence taken from the victim's blood. With Underwood now physically linked to the murder victim, police finally had the evidence they needed. A warrant was obtained for his arrest. Underwood's game of cat and mouse had come to an end. Police theorized that on December 3rd, having seen his ex-girlfriend with another man, Underwood became enraged with jealousy. He paid a late-night visit to Gunnarson's apartment and abducted his rival. With his victim tied up inside the trunk, Underwood drove for over an hour before arriving at Gunnarson's final destination. He fired 2 shots into Gunnarson's head, then began the process of covering up his crime. In July of 1997, L.C. Underwood was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Fueled by jealous rage, L.C. Underwood would stop at nothing to keep Kay Wheaton in his life. Others will use manipulation and murder as a means to satisfy their desires. An hour north of Los Angeles, the Pacific Coast Highway winds its way through Ventura, a city of beautiful beaches, a thriving harbor, and a close-knit community. On May 6, 1996, Michael Daly contacted the Ventura Police Department to report his wife Sherry missing. He told police that his wife had driven their boys to school early that morning. When it came time to pick the children up 3 hours later, she didn't show. The 35-year-old woman was known as a loving and responsible mother. It wasn't like her to forget her children. He said that his wife had planned to do some shopping earlier in the day. No one had heard from her since. Detective Sean Conroy of the Ventura Police Department worked the case. He knew from experience that Sherry may have gone missing on purpose.
Well, the reaction to any missing persons case is generally, if a full-grown adult is missing, it's because they want to be missing.
But concerned family members didn't believe that Sherry would leave her children. They drove around town until they spotted Sherry's van in the parking lot of a discount store. They contacted police. Inside the vehicle, investigators found her keys, purse, and a Mother's Day gift she'd purchased at the store. There were no other clues, nor any indication of a struggle. The following day, detectives convened for their regular weekly meeting. One of the officers mentioned that a Ventura resident had called in about having seen a strange arrest the day before. It was in the same parking lot where Sherry Daly's van was found. They paid a visit to the witness. He said he saw a woman fitting Sherry's description, being handcuffed by a blonde woman in a tan suit. The blonde appeared to be a law enforcement officer. He then saw the woman in handcuffs being placed into a green car and driven away. The witness tried to catch the license plate, but it appeared to have been masked over. Investigators were now hopeful that Sherry was not missing at all.
At that time, we felt that another police agency had come in our jurisdiction and made an arrest without notifying us. And we felt that by making a few phone calls that we would discover that the person in the missing persons report, Sherry Daly, had been arrested, and we had solved the case with just a few hours' work.
But any hope for a speedy resolution was soon crushed. No law enforcement officer from Ventura or any other jurisdiction had any record of such an incident. Police now believed they had a kidnapping on their hands. And with no communication from the kidnapper, they feared they might also be looking at a homicide. Detectives wanted to interview Michael Daly in greater detail, but when they went to talk to him, they found him with another woman. Her name was Diana Hahn. Both were brought in for questioning.
Tell me about your day yesterday.
Detective Skip Young interviewed Michael Daly.
In our first several conversations with Michael, he did not appear to be the worried, frantic, concerned husband that you or I may be. He was very matter of fact, didn't have a reasonable explanation as to why his wife would leave him.
Daly told police that at the time of his wife's disappearance, he'd been at the grocery store where he worked. The alibi checked out. Daly's girlfriend, Diana Hahn, denied any knowledge of Sherry's whereabouts. But it wasn't her statement that raised suspicions.
You got a scratch on your forehead?
Hidden beneath her bangs, Hahn sported some fresh scratches.
And how did you say we see those injuries?
She claimed she'd had a bike accident and tumbled over the handlebars. Investigators weren't buying the story.
Yeah.
We know from years of police experience that it's impossible for someone to fall over the handlebars of a bike without putting their hands out to break their fall. It's an automatic reflex. Yet she had no injuries on her hands. She had no injuries on her knees. We knew at that point that she was lying to us.
Place the ruler up against the bruise.
Photographs of the injury were taken. In the pictures, investigators could also see faint bruising on her arms and hands. It appeared that someone had gripped her so tightly that they even caused bruises to her fingers. Police suspected that Hahn was involved in the kidnapping. She didn't own a green car, but she could have rented one. Investigators canvassed rental car agencies in the Ventura County area. They learned that a car was rented the day before Sherry's disappearance and returned the day after, with 126 miles put on it. The name of the renter, records showed, was Diana Hahn. Her credit card had been used to pay for the car, and her signature was noted on the form. Detective Conroy hoped that an examination of the rented vehicle would help them find out what happened to Sherry Daly.
Even though the abduction had happened, at least a week prior to this, the rental agency had not re-rented the car. We asked them why. The car had been returned with the rear view mirror knocked off of the front windshield.
Investigators confirmed the car rented by Hahn was green, exactly as witnesses had described. It was towed to the Ventura Crime Lab. There, criminalists processed the vehicle, searching for any sign of Sherry Daly. Throughout the car, they noticed staining. It appeared to be blood. To find out, technicians used moistened swabs to collect the samples. In the lab, the samples were placed in a tube with a chemical that reacts to blood. If blood is present, the swab turns bluish-green. Using this method, Ventura Police Detective Harry Scott got many conclusive results.
We found that there was blood on the passenger handle, the door handle on the inside. We found blood and where it had been washed up on the ceiling or the headliner area of the car, and also some blood in the trunk of the car.
Lab work confirmed that the blood was human. But there, investigators reached a dead end. Though they suspected the blood was Sherry's, they had no record of her blood type. But science has new ways around that obstacle. Technicians took blood samples from Daly's parents. From these, they generated DNA barcodes and compared them against the DNA rendered from the blood in the car. The results were unmistakable. The blood found in the car had come from the biological child of Sherry Daly's parents. But it was not an encouraging finding. The presence of her blood throughout the vehicle confirmed their worst fears. It was unlikely they would find Sherry alive. Diana Hahn was now the prime suspect. But since they didn't have a body, they couldn't prove that a murder had been committed. The police weren't the only ones looking for answers.
This is where the community stepped up, and friends of Sherry Daly each weekend morning would gather at the department store where she was abducted, and they would go out in search parties.
On June 1st, nearly a month after the abduction, searchers noticed the odor of decomposition in a remote location on the outskirts of Ventura. Scouring the area along the embankment, investigators found a human skull. They believed they had uncovered the final resting place of Sherry Daly. Police in Ventura, California, continued searching for Sherry Daly, a young wife and a mother of two who had unexpectedly disappeared. A month after she was reported missing by her husband, investigators believed they had finally found her. The search party combed the scene. In the area where the skull and skeletal remains were found, pieces of jewelry were also uncovered. The items were carefully collected in the hope that someone could identify them as Sherry Daly's. Investigators also found clothing identical to the outfit Sherry was wearing when she was last seen. Their condition told a lot.
We were able to match the clothing to the bones, and we were actually able to determine that there were numerous stab wounds through the shirt and through the bra that showed up on the ribs of the victim.
Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Sherry Daly. Analysis showed that whoever killed her did so with a vengeance. In addition to the multiple stab wounds, her neck had been severed with a sharp object. The medical examiner concluded that after a long, vigorous struggle, the victim had been nearly beheaded. The autopsy findings were consistent with the blood staining found in Diana Hahn's rental car. And if Hahn had endured a lengthy struggle with Daly, it would explain the scratches and bruising that covered the suspect's forehead and arms during her first interview. Detectives believed that Diana Hahn had killed Sherry Daly, but they didn't think she had planned the murder on her own.
Monthly phone totals for the last.
Searching Hahn's calling card records from the day of the murder, Detective Skip Young found evidence that her lover had been in on the plot.
The day of the murder, we were able to determine that there was at least 3 telephone communications from Diana Hahn to Michael Daly the morning of the actual kidnapping and homicide.
One of the calls was made to him from a payphone just minutes from the ravine where the body was found. It appeared that Hahn was checking in with Daly. Police focus turned back to the victim's husband.
Take a look at this one right here.
Investigators learned from witnesses that Michael Daly was a drug user and that he'd been flaunting his affair with Hahn for the past few years.
We learned from close friends and neighbors that Sherry had reportedly given Michael an ultimatum: clean up your act, knock off the drug use, drop the other woman, and supposedly Sherry was actually seeking the advice of an attorney.
Investigators speculated that with Sherry out of the way, Daly wouldn't have to comply with his wife's demands. He could pursue his new relationship without having to pay alimony or share his children.
A lot of activity during
To detectives' way of thinking, he had a lot to gain from his wife's disappearance. The evidence against Diana Hahn and Michael Daly was damaging, but investigators still hadn't physically connected them to the kidnapping or the murder. If they were going to make a case stick, they'd need some evidence proving that Hahn had disguised herself as a blonde law enforcement officer. Again, the close-knit community came forward to help. A clerk who was following the case in the press told police that she remembered selling Diana Hahn a blonde wig sometime before the murder. The clerk also commented that she had noticed a photograph of a man and 2 children inside Hahn's purse. She assumed the photo was of Hahn's family. Police showed the clerk a photo of Michael Daly and his 2 kids. It was the same photograph the clerk had seen in Hahn's purse. Investigators learned that Diana Hahn couldn't have children of her own. They began to suspect that Michael Daly had manipulated her with promises of a bright new future.
We'll be in touch.
Detectives continued to build their case. They pored over Hahn's financial records, including copies of checks.
1503.
One of them was written to a large discount store just days before the abduction. The list of items purchased included a piece of poster board, plastic trash bags, a 2-piece tan uniform, and a hatchet. Police obtained a warrant to search Hahn's home. They never found the hatchet or the uniform, but they did locate a piece of poster board. The barcode number on the poster board was identical to that recorded on the receipt. They couldn't understand how the board fit on Hahn's shopping list until they took a close look at the shape cut out of it. It was exactly the same shape as a license plate. That explained why witnesses couldn't see a license plate number. Hahn had covered it over with a fake.
Okay, so we gotta be pretty serious about how we plan this.
But it was unlikely that Hahn thought of that herself.
What we should do is we should get a wig and...
Investigators believe that Daly masterminded the murder plot days in advance.
So it looks like she's getting arrested over some drug deals.
Motivated by the lure of a new life with Michael, Hahn was more than willing to dispose of the one thing she believed was standing in their way. Police believe that a disguised Diana Hahn approached Sherry as she was leaving the store parking lot. Pretending to be a law enforcement officer, she lured Sherry from the car and handcuffed her. The staged arrest worked to plan, but investigators believe that Sherry Daly quickly saw through the ruse.
It is our belief that within a short period of time after Sherry was abducted in the green vehicle, that she somehow recognized Diana Hahn, disguise and all. We can tell by the damage to the interior of the vehicle, mainly the rearview mirror had been knocked off, that Sherry obviously put up some type of a struggle.
But Sherry couldn't fight off her attacker. After driving her to a remote location, Hahn viciously stabbed Daly at least 17 times and placed the body into the ravine. Diana Hahn was arrested for the murder of Sherry Daly on August 1st, 1996. From her jail cell, she reluctantly implicated Michael Daly as the mastermind behind the plot. Daly was arrested the following November. Though the murder investigation had come to an end, Ventura would be forever haunted by the young housewife's tragic end.
All she wanted to do was to have a family, have a husband, raise her children. I still think about this case. I still think about what was going through Sherry Daly's mind when she realized that it was Diana Hahn behind the wheel and she was going to have to fight for her life.
Diana Hahn was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tried 6 months later, Michael Daly was also found guilty in the murder of his wife. He was also sentenced to life in prison. Diana Hahn and Michael Daly were willing to destroy a family in order to be together. When money is at stake, some family bonds can become twisted and deadly. Nestled in the Rocky Mountains of western Montana, Mineral County is known for its frontier feel. But simple lifestyles aren't immune from deadly mishaps. On November 28, 1995, Chris Hansen's wife Nanette went to the stable to feed the couple's horses. She never came back to the house. Hansen found his 34-year-old wife lying in the mud. She was cold and pale. Hansen called 911. He thought that maybe Nanette had been trampled by horses.
It's my wife.
She was either dead or dying.
I think she's dead. I think she's dead.
The operator immediately dispatched an ambulance.
All right.
When paramedics arrived, Nanette was not breathing. She had no pulse. All her husband Chris and stepson Scott could do was watch as they attempted to revive Nanette with CPR. At first, paramedics' efforts seemed promising. The victim took a single gasp of air on her own. But that breath would be her last. She was declared dead. Since they performed coroner's duties in this small town, the sheriff's department was also contacted. Chris Hansen told investigators he stumbled upon Nanette's body in the muddy trail next to the horse pasture. He said that after calling 911, he phoned his son, Scott Abe, but there was nothing they could do. Because of his multiple sclerosis, he had very poor eyesight. If he had seen her sooner, he may have been able to save her life. Returning from the accident scene to the Mineral County Sheriff's Department, Under-Sheriff Anita Parkin had no reason to believe that Nanette's death was anything but an unfortunate accident.
And she did have some bruises that looked like maybe a horse stepped on her or something similar of that nature. And with the conditions in the barnyard, I could see where somebody may have been knocked down or slipped or something happened of that nature.
News of Nanette's death spread through the small 3,000-person community. With it, suspicions swirled. Within hours, friends and neighbors of the victim were calling the sheriff's department to voice their misgivings about the tragedy. No one in the community believed Nanette Hansen's death was an accident. Police in Mineral County, Montana continued their investigation into the death of 34-year-old Nanette Hansen, accidentally killed by one of her horses. But the community wasn't buying that scenario. Close friends came forward to urge further investigation into Nanette's death.
So, I understand that you knew
To them, the accident didn't make sense. Nanette was experienced with the care and control of horses. She owned only gentle, slow-moving animals. The Mineral County Prosecutor's Office was receiving calls from the same skeptical friends. But so far, there wasn't any evidence to merit the town's suspicion. Attorney Sean Donovan consulted with the sheriff's department. They decided that the only way to dispel the rumors was to have the body autopsied.
And we both agreed that just for the sake of putting to rest these concerns that the neighbors had, we ought to just have that done, expecting nothing to turn up.
The victim's remains were transported to the state crime lab in Missoula. There, medical examiner Gary Dale was asked to determine what caused Nanette Hansen's death.
So generally, in fatal horse accidents, the fatalities are due to skull fractures, cervical fractures, and unless someone's rolled over by a horse. And there was no external evidence of any readily fatal type injuries. The injuries pretty much consisted of scrapes and bruises.
Nanette's skull hadn't been fractured. Her spinal cord was intact. There had been no severe bleeding. The injuries that were found were relatively minor. A network of small scratches on her head and a 2-inch bruise to the left temple. They shaved the hair overlying the bruise and noticed an unusual pattern on the scalp. They could not immediately identify the source of the injury. Nothing about these injuries fit the profile of a horse trampling. Internal examination of the body turned up a large amount of mud and barnyard debris in the victim's lungs. She hadn't died from trampling. She died of asphyxiation.
And in this case, you could raise a possibility that she was rendered unconscious by a blow, somehow slammed by a horse against the stall of the barn, and went down face first into this muck in the barnyard, and then that she basically drowned or suffocated in that muck. There, and then this one.
But there was a major fault in that scenario. Nanette had suffered only superficial head injuries. There was no evidence of any brain trauma that would cause her to lose consciousness. A grim new theory formed.
There was a fair probability that she was held face down into the ground, into the soft, wet soil, by her forearms, by her hands, and that pressure was being applied to her back and to the back of her head. She's basically being forced face first into that.
What had initially appeared to be an accident was now being called a homicide.
As soon as that happened, we switched from this being a coroner's inquest, which is how this had begun, to being a criminal investigation.
With a homicide case opened, the victim's husband, Chris Hansen, was brought in for questioning. They hoped that he could help them find out who might want his wife dead. Though Nanette Hansen's death had been ruled an accident, an autopsy led Montana investigators to open a homicide case. Detectives questioned her husband, Chris Hansen. The many bruises and scrapes on Nanette's body suggested there had been a struggle leading to her death. To find out if Chris Hansen had been on the other end of that struggle, they asked him to remove his shirt. He was covered with what looked like fingernail scratches. When asked to explain the marks, he claimed that he'd tripped and fallen inside the house. Hansen stated that with his multiple sclerosis and near blindness, there was no way he could have physically dominated his wife.
Thank you.
Though he was telling the truth about his MS, he appeared to be overplaying his handicap.
We later learned during the investigation that he was able to play dice and see the different dice, was able to stand beside a pool table and know which number were on the balls, and that he had applied for and received a big game hunting license in 1994.
Go ahead and write down your statement as what occurred on that.
Though he may have been too weak to work, investigators believed he was strong enough to beat up his wife. Nanette's friends and co-workers said that she frequently had black eyes and bruises. Things had been particularly bad, investigators learned, since Chris's son, Scott Abe, came to town. The 31-year-old hadn't seen his father since he was a small boy. About a year before Nanette's death, he came for a visit and decided to stay. He rented a trailer just a few minutes away and started building a cabin on their property. For father and son, it was blissful reunion. Investigators began looking into Abe's background as well.
Say bad things about her other than that?
A co-worker told investigators that Abe had been very vocal about his hatred of Nanette. He boasted that he could stage an accidental death by nailing a horseshoe to a board and beating her with it. He said he would do anything to keep her from getting her hands on his father's property and inheritance. Abe appeared to have gotten his way. Poring over records, detectives learned that in the weeks before Nanette's death, Abe had prompted his father to financially separate himself from Nanette. Hansen complied. He canceled their joint credit cards and opened a new bank account in his name only. It wasn't enough information to make an arrest, but it did get the sheriff's department a warrant to search Abe's property. They searched for any objects that matched the mysterious pattern of cuts and bruises on the victim's scalp. In his trailer, they found a pair of boots. The tread pattern looked eerily familiar. In Abe's car, detectives made another discovery. A homemade weapon called a sap. A leather pouch filled with metal objects. The items were sent to the Montana State Crime Lab. Simply believing that the father and son team had killed Nanette was not enough to prove murder. Unless someone could draw an irrefutable link between this evidence and her injuries, the two would never be charged. Investigators' best hope was now in the hands of forensic expert Debbie Hewitt.
It's kind of like putting a puzzle together where you pick up this piece of puzzle and pick up this piece of puzzle and see if it will fit in the appropriate space. And when you do find that one final puzzle piece, you know that you have the complete picture all done.
Hewitt began her analysis with the boots. She pressed the treads into an inked pad, then made numerous impressions on clean white paper. These prints were then transferred to clear sheets of acetate. By placing the prints over a life-sized photograph of the wound, she could determine whether the boot made the injury. The sole pattern from Abe's boot matched the injury on Nanette's scalp. Hewitt repeated the same process with the sap, inking and printing the weapon from a variety of angles. When compared against the large bruise on the victim's temple, the last piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. The sap was shown to be a perfect fit for the wound on the side of Nanette's head. Father and son had teamed up to do away with the woman who came between them and their greed.
You're under arrest for the murder.
But their plot didn't hold up to forensic scrutiny. On February 2nd, 1996, Chris Hansen and Scott Abe were arrested. Prosecutors theorized that Abe first stunned Nanette with the sap, then wrestled her into the mud to make it look like an accident. While Hansen restrained her, his son placed his foot on her head, holding her down until she stopped breathing. Had it not been for the insistence of Nanette's close friends, this brutal act would have stayed buried forever.
If she had not been rerouted to the pathologist for an autopsy, we never would have seen these particular types of injuries and bruises, and the case would have been written off as an accidental.
Both Scott Abe and Chris Hansen were convicted of homicide and sentenced to 60 years in prison. When a murder is cleverly disguised, investigators must find new ways to see through the deception. They turn to forensic scientists to reveal the truth and to bring justice to victims who are killed for love or money. A friendly Midwest lodge becomes the scene of a gruesome double murder. 2 men are dead and a safe filled with cash is missing. But the investigation runs cold until several crucial tips and equally solid lab work pry the case wide open. In Michigan, an elderly man is found brutally bludgeoned. dead in his own home. Detectives have more questions than answers as they follow a forensic trail of lies and deception, leading to an unlikely killer. Two completely separate crimes, two different killers with one common thread. Both possess a murderous rage stemming from raw greed. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Dayton, Ohio, the heart of the Midwest, where old-fashioned values are appreciated and crime still shocks the core of the community. St. Patrick's Day is usually a time of celebration, but in March of 1994, the party's aftermath took a deadly turn. Mary Pickett's husband, Frank, was unusually late. Early that morning, he'd gone back to the local lodge to clean up after the St. Patrick's Day party the night before. Mary hadn't heard from him all day, so she decided to drive to the lodge to see if he was okay. Frank's vehicle was still parked outside, and the side door of the lodge was wide open. She instinctively began to fear the worst and phoned the police. Dayton police officers responded to the scene.
My husband didn't come home last night, so I called over here and there was no answer.
Yeah, stay by the front door.
Nervously, Mary waited while the officer entered the lodge. He noticed something unsettling. The St. Patrick's Day decorations were still hanging, and it was eerily quiet. Then, on the floor of the kitchen, he discovered a lifeless body.
I'm gonna need for you to stay by the front door. Don't let anybody in.
Concerned the assailant may still be in the building, officers cautiously searched the area. The perpetrator was long gone, but before he fled, he left another calling card, a second victim. On the men's room floor, another man was dead. With not much to go on, police launched a full-scale murder investigation. Mary Pickett confirmed the identity of her husband and the other victim, maintenance worker Boyd Walker. She explained Frank and Boyd were on the cleanup committee and were getting the lodge ready for their weekly meeting. Dayton Police Detective Doyle Burke examined the bloody scene and began to piece together the events that led up to the murders.
The first thing that caught my eye was the doors were very formidably locked. However, they didn't appear to have been tampered, so I felt there was definitely no forced entry.
Detective Burke looked around for other clues and saw the cigarette machine had been pried open and nearly all the money was gone. He then found a bloody hammer on the floor of the back office.
It looks like some blood and hair on that hammer there. Do anything you want to take?
Crime scene technicians photographed the possible murder weapon. It was carefully collected and sent into the lab for analysis. Detective Burke's next move was to reconstruct the crime step by step.
The victim was in the restroom area, and he appeared to have been laid out there and then beaten to death rather than just caught by surprise. The other victim in the food preparation area was very different. He appeared to have been caught off guard before he was beaten. I kind of thought that perhaps he was the one that may have opened the door for the suspect.
Samples of the blood found in both rooms were preserved and sent to the lab along with the other evidence gathered at the scene. Detective Burke took note of the blood spatter on the walls and the floor, hoping the pattern would be a clue as to how these two men died. As coroners removed the victims' bodies from the lodge, Detective Burke had many questions about the killer. He believed the men not only knew their killer, they may have opened the door for him.
Okay, I think I'll expedite it.
The autopsies were performed at the Montgomery County Coroner's Office by Dr. Russell Updegrove.
Palpate a few skull fractures here also. We're going to need a photograph of this.
Preliminary findings indicated that Frank Pickett received 19 blows to the head. Boyd Walker had been struck 18 times. Both victims suffered cerebral contusions.
With a hard tile floor surface, and looking at the blood, it looks like he may have just been caught by surprise from behind.
Dr. Updegrove's findings also revealed the murder weapon left crescent-shaped marks on the back of their heads.
Upon further examination of the individuals at the injuries sustained on the heads of these individuals was consistent with the types of injuries that could be inflicted with a hammer.
Forensic scientist Denise Rankin processed the hammer at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab.
I examined the hammer for blood and for hair. I attempted to remove the hairs from the hammer, and there were red stains, which I tested to determine if they were blood, and I determined that they were blood, and they were a mixture of both victims' blood.
The analysis performed on the hammer came up empty. The investigation stalled. A task force meeting was called to determine the next move.
At this point, we've got nothing on it. You guys are the main crews downtown.
Detective Burke was joined by Detective Tom Lawson. Together, they headed up the task force.
We got nothing. What you guys got?
One officer learned a vagrant named Timothy Clifford had been trying to scam money from a local church on the day of the murder.
Timothy Clifford?
It was the first solid lead.
In following up on Timothy Clifford, who was an initial suspect in these offenses, the first thing we obviously did was took steps to locate him.
Detectives found Timothy Clifford at a local homeless shelter not far from the lodge. Clifford admitted he was begging at the church that day, but claimed he was in the shelter all morning.
I went to church to get some money.
He said the shelter had a book that kept track of the residents' whereabouts.
It was a lockdown facility, and during the time frame that these homicides occurred, his whereabouts were verified at that shelter.
The lead was a dead end. Detective Burke hoped the lodge manager could provide the investigation with a much-needed jump start. The manager told the detective the safe was missing. It contained all the proceeds from the party. He also said a two-wheeled dolly was missing from the back office. The manager explained to Detective Burke that Frank Pickett had an unusual habit of sealing the deposit bags with duct tape before depositing them at the bank. And since the detectives believed the men knew their killer, the lodge manager provided them with a list of employees and members, both past and present.
I had a strong belief that it was somebody familiar with the operation, and of course the first place I'm going to look is ex-employees and then current employees.
The next step was to track down anyone who might know why Frank Pickett and Boyd Walker ended up dead.
Hey, didn't you work over at Hoppy's for a while?
After speaking to dozens of people, police came up empty-handed. The former workers and members all had solid alibis and had no motive for murder. But back at the station, calls and tips were pouring in. And this time, there were some promising leads. Police began to see a pattern. Most of the information revolved around one man, Edmund Emmerich. One caller said Emmerich bragged of being able to lift a safe single-handedly. And another caller said he once saw Emmerich pry open a cigarette machine at a bar. But the biggest break came when a phone tipster came into the police station.
No one tip in and of itself that was enough to say that Emmerich committed these crimes. But when the volume kept coming in with information about Emmerich and multiple tips and information about Emmerich, certainly he became an individual we were very interested in.
What you have to see right here.
The informant was a local man familiar with Edmund Emmerich. He knew Emmerich had worked for a bar in the neighborhood. He said Emmerich had a reputation for beating up patrons in his own bar. Then he would call the cops and say they passed out. He said he saw Emmerich in another local hangout, getting change from the bartender when his bar ran out. He stated that Edmund Emmerich could be intimidating, a local who clearly knew his way around the bar district. He also told police Emmerich bragged that he knew where the lodge kept their safe.
There was information about Emmerich losing his job and needing money, and then shortly after these offenses, having money. So each little piece of the pie basically in and of themselves were not enough, but when they culminated, it was clear he was of high interest to us.
Police needed to find out as much information as they could about Edmund Emmerich. It didn't take long to find out he had a police record. A record which included an outstanding traffic warrant and, more interestingly, an arrest for safecracking in the state of Ohio. Once his name came up in the investigation, detectives began to keep an eye on him. The outstanding traffic warrant gave them what they needed to take him off the streets.
Stop right there, sir. Take your hands out of your pockets for me. Stand still for a minute. I need to talk to you.
The warrant gave detectives the perfect opportunity to interrogate Emmerich for a far more insidious crime, the double murder.
In the course of the investigation, we pursued several leads, but again, everything kept coming back to Emmerich.
And for the first time in this particularly violent and frustrating case, it looked as if detectives Burke and Lawson finally had a solid lead and a potential murder suspect. Dayton, Ohio detectives were making headway in the gruesome double murder that took place at a local lodge the morning after St. Patrick's Day. They had a few clues, a stolen safe, a missing dolly, and a bloody hammer. But nothing added up. After hitting several dead ends, one name repeatedly turned up on the crime tip line: Edmund Emmerich. Emmerich worked at several bars in the vicinity of the lodge and had a reputation for being hot-headed and dangerous. He had an outstanding arrest warrant, and police picked him up. Detective Doyle Burke believed they were on the right track.
There was information that was received about Emmerich being very brutal and very physical.
After his arrest, Edmund Emmerich jumped to the top of the detective suspect list when they noticed bloodstains on his clothing.
I cut myself shaving. Looks like blood to me.
He claimed he had cut himself shaving, but the detectives remained skeptical. Something didn't add up. His alibi was a little too good.
What I want to do is, for someone to tell me minute by minute, hour by hour, exactly what they had done is suspicious.
Detectives Burke and Lawson asked Emmerich to surrender his clothes as evidence.
The blood that was found on Emmerich when he was first arrested was on his shirt and on his shoes and also on his jacket.
He spent the night in jail while his clothes were sent to the lab for blood analysis. The detectives hoped the blood on Emmerich's clothes would match the victim's blood. The evidence was tested at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab. Denise Rankin explains.
There was blood on the clothing that was consistent with the suspect's own blood on his own clothes.
But like the hammer, the blood on the clothes did not bring the detectives any closer to catching the killer. In fact, the jacket appeared to support the suspect's story that he had cut himself shaving. But detectives Burke and Lawson weren't giving up on Edmund Emmerich. A warrant was issued to search his house. They discovered a deposit bag sealed with duct tape. An informant had told detectives one of the murder victims sealed the bags for deposit in the same manner. Technicians photographed the evidence and took several other items of Emmerich's clothing for further forensic testing.
And you just step right down there to that gate for me.
With no immediate proof to hold Emmerich, the suspect was released. But Burke and Lawson believed they had their man. They just had to prove it. The day after his release, detectives had Emmerich's car impounded. Evidence technicians went over the automobile with a fine-tooth comb. Inside the car, they found an additional hammer and a lug wrench. Each was gathered and sent to the lab.
Get that sample and get a
Technicians took gray paint samples from smudges found inside Emmerich's car door. Investigators believed the paint might be from the lodge's missing safe. The paint smudges were analyzed at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab by Director Ken Betts.
We're looking to make the determination whether the paint, gray paint that's on the safe, was also left on the vehicle in question by the suspects.
Investigator Burke and Lawson's next move was to check on Emmerich's ever so careful alibi, starting with his family. Emmerich claimed to have spent the morning of March 19th visiting his father before heading to a local laundromat. The detectives were not surprised, nor convinced, when Emmerich's father confirmed his alibi. But a female employee at the laundromat was more helpful in punching holes in Emmerich's story. She said his behavior was suspicious on that day, that he parked unusually far away from the front door, especially since he had an incredible amount of clothes to be cleaned.
The amount of clothes that Emmerich had picked up that day was unusual, and I believe that was part of the prepared alibi, that he wanted to make it so memorable that the laundromat would remember this individual had so many clothes. It was such a big order.
But the most damning thing the laundromat worker remembered was that Emmerich left a two-wheel dolly in the parking lot of the laundromat, just like the one missing from the lodge.
And his alibi ultimately was part of his downfall, in that it leads us to being able to verify that a two-wheel dolly is taken from the scene of the crime, and Emmerich's in possession of a two-wheel dolly just moments after the crimes have occurred.
Then a phone call came into the Dayton Police Department. It was the break the detectives had been waiting for. A discarded safe found right in the area where Emmerich had based his whole alibi. A safe so heavy, even a strong man like Emmerich would need a dolly to transport it. Police examined the abandoned safe found outside a hardware store. The front door had been completely pried off. The local hardware store clerk said she had seen a white male matching Emmerich's description, wheeling the safe down the street on a two-wheel dolly. It was as if the dam had burst open on the case. And the safe and the dolly were just the beginning. Test results came back from the forensics lab. There was blood on one of Emmerich's shirts, and it matched the blood of one of the murder victims.
The blood on the shirt was from the scene, and we were able to tie him to that scene with that blood.
Evidence was mounting, and detectives were closing in on Edmund Emmerich. But it would take one more piece of damning forensic evidence and an eyewitness to bring this killer to justice. Local bartender Edmund Emmerich was the strongest suspect detectives Burke and Lawson had in their investigation of a brutal double murder and robbery at a local lodge in downtown Dayton, Ohio. Emmerich had a reputation for violence and a criminal conviction for safecracking. A combination of circumstantial and definitive evidence was mounting a case against the suspect. But it was a paint smudge found inside Emmerich's car that provided a crucial piece of physical evidence. At the State Crime Lab, Director Ken Betts compared the paint smudge found in the car to paint scraped from an abandoned safe.
We were able to determine that the paint found on the vehicle was consistent with the gray paint of the safe. And it became another investigative tool for Dayton Police detectives to go forward with.
After chasing down leads for weeks, detectives Burke and Lawson were finalizing their case against Edmund Emmerich. But there was one more piece of evidence. An eyewitness came forward. His name was Brian Towns, a local homeless man who actually saw Emmerich enter the lodge on the morning of the killings.
In interviewing him, we were able to determine that he not only saw Emmerich down at the scene of the crime that day, he saw the door that he entered in, he also saw him exit, and also even spoke with Emmerich during the time frame that we were certain these homicides had occurred. Eddie went into Hoppy's.
When Emmerich came out of the bar, Towns bummed $20 from him and watched him go on his way. Detective Burke showed Towns some photos, and the homeless man positively ID'd Emmerich.
You saw at Hoppy's that day?
Yeah.
That's Eddie. Off hours with only two people there, you're not going to let a stranger in, and we come to find out that Emmerich did know both individuals. Emmerich, of course, through Brian Towns, was identified as being at the scene.
Detectives now had a man placing Emmerich at the scene of the crime at the time of the murders. But they were taking no chances before arresting Emmerich again. Back at the crime lab, another piece of forensic evidence proved Edmund Emmerich was the killer. Toolmark examiner Tim Dewar cast impressions from the lug wrench found in Emmerich's car.
Identifying a tool mark to a specific tool is like identifying a latent fingerprint at a crime scene to a known fingerprint of a suspect.
The impressions from the lug wrench were then compared to molds of impressions found on both the cigarette machine and the safe from the lodge. They were a perfect match.
The castings from the cigarette machine were microscopically compared to the castings of the test tool marks from the tire iron. Upon comparison, several matches were found between the two, and with that, the conclusion can be drawn that the tire tool made the tool marks on the cigarette machine, to the exclusion of all other tools.
The tool impression match was the final piece of the evidence puzzle. Not only did police have an eyewitness placing Emmerich at the scene, they now had clear evidence. He had broken into the cigarette machine and safe. Police went in to make an arrest. Although Emmerich tried to run, the police completely surrounded the house. There was nowhere for Emmerich to hide. After weeks of tracking down the killer, detectives got their man. And they were now about to get the full story of what happened at the lodge that tragic morning. As suspected, Boyd Walker knew his killer and naively opened the door to his own murderer. He had no way of knowing that Emmerich had come into the bar intent on murder and robbery. When Walker turned his back, Emmerich grabbed a hammer and brutally killed him. Just as viciously as he had struck Boyd Walker, Emmerich killed Frank Pickett. In just a matter of minutes, both men were dead. Emmerich scrambled, grabbed the dolly, and wheeled the safe out of the lodge. He later abandoned the dolly in the laundromat parking lot.
Emmerich was in dire need of money, and this was an opportunity to take advantage of two individuals that would trust him.
Edmund Emmerich was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder for his fatal assault on the 2 bar workers, as well as a count of robbery. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. Some killers prey on unsuspecting targets of opportunity, making it easier for them to conceal their identity. Others strike closer to home, leaving behind traces of raw greed. Emmett Township is a rapidly growing community of 12,000 people located on the eastern border of Battle Creek, Michigan. They pride themselves on being a close-knit, safe haven. Which is why what happened on the morning of April 26, 1996, was such a shock to the small town. That morning, Sharon Zachary went to check on Bob Rogers. She had been taking care of the 81-year-old man and rented a house down the street from him. Sharon was worried. She hadn't heard from Bob all morning. When Sharon saw his car at the side of his house, she became particularly concerned. He never parked there, and he hadn't been answering his phone. Her concerns were instantly confirmed when she saw the sliding side door to the house had been completely smashed in. She ran for help. Sharon Zachary was panicked. Her friend Bob had been the victim of several robberies in recent months. It looked as if this was another one.
Attention all Emmett officers. Be advised, 7419 Jefferson Drive, our check welfare possible assault.
Officers were familiar with Bob Rogers. It was not the first time they had been summoned to his residence. They knew the elderly man had a reputation for being a pack rat and for keeping large amounts of cash around the house. They entered the home carefully and cautiously so they would not disturb any potential evidence. But this time, the crime was worse. There, lying face up in his family room, was Bob Rogers. And he was dead.
Hello? Is Bob okay?
No, he's not, man.
We have signal 15 here. I'm going to need nav tech, also notify command, please.
Emmett police now had what appeared to be a homicide on their hands. Lieutenant Thomas Headley arrived, prepared to begin the investigation. His first move was to speak with Sharon Zachary, the woman who had discovered the body.
The house here, Mr. Rogers' house. The other officer arrived.
After asking her to go to the station to make a statement, he examined the bloody crime scene. From the start, Lieutenant Headley knew this crime did not happen like the others.
This crime scene is a little bit odd to me. It's not consistent with what we know of the behavior of Mr. Rogers. Also, the fact that the sliding glass door was broken in the rear of the house was not consistent with the other crime scenes. People did not have to go through that effort to gain insurance.
Among the strewn clothing and blood spatter, the crime tech team took measurements, photos, and samples, all potential evidence. Forensic technicians paid particularly close attention to the victim's twisted belt buckle.
Pick it up, we'll get one more.
Glass shards were photographed and collected for possible hand or footprints. Not surprising to Lieutenant Headley was the large amounts of cash found stashed in various places around the room.
He was an elderly male, probably lived during the Depression, carried the money on him probably as a feeling of security.
Headley knew one thing. He was certain money was the motive. Now he had to find out who was responsible. At the Emmett police station, Lieutenant Anthony Geigel questioned Sharon Zachary. She told Lieutenant Geigel about her relationship with Bob Rogers.
You know, because every once in a while he'd
She said she befriended the old man and rented one of his many properties. Zachary explained she was concerned about Mr. Rogers' safety, and she even insisted that he move in with her. She said she was tired of standing idly by while the old man repeatedly was the victim of violent robberies.
went to the door.
Zachary told the lieutenant she saw no one the morning she found Bob Rogers' body. She went to his home when she hadn't heard from him. But to Geigel, there was something a little off about Sharon Zachary's story, and something odd about the whole murder.
The crime scene didn't match what had normally occurred in the past. The scene just had an aura about it that just something didn't seem right. It almost appeared that somebody tried really hard to make this look like a robbery.
Bob Rogers' autopsy was performed at the Sparrow Hospital morgue. Dr. Joyce DeYoung fingerprinted the victim post-mortem. She needed to determine which prints found on the scene belonged to the victim and which belonged to the possible killer or killers. DeYoung noted severe blunt trauma to Rogers' head and body.
Mr. Rogers had between 25 and 30 blows to the head. Most of the injuries to the head were of the back and on the left side of the head, which certainly would suggest that the blows were being inflicted from somebody from behind.
Judging from the position of Rogers' body and its decomposition, Dr. DeYoung concluded that Rogers' body was most likely moved after his fatal beating. She called Lieutenant Geigel to report her conclusions.
There is a pool of blood near the body that appeared to be where the body was in a face-down position, and then the body is rolled, and the hands and the forearms are up in the air after rigor mortis had set.
With fingerprints from the victim, forensic scientists began piecing together Bob Rogers' murder. Using a technique specifically designed for lifting fingerprints from porous surfaces, they analyzed the victim's belt. Numerous prints were lifted from the belt. Most of them belonged to Rogers, but one did not.
In fact, if it was someone other than the victim's print on their pants, then obviously it was somebody that touched that area. It would not likely have remained on the surface of the belt while the victim was wearing it in a conventional manner.
Scientists also found some compelling evidence on one of the shards from the broken sliding glass door. It was a muddy tennis shoe imprint.
Simply by walking over glass, the design elements of the shoe are reproduced on that glass with incredible detail. Including the not only the design, but wear characteristics, size, the individual characteristics, unique features about a shoe that enable us to positively identify the shoe.
The evidence was compelling, but it seemed to be leading nowhere. Lieutenant Geigel had no suspects, and every day that passed was another day the killer was free. Emmett Township Police were investigating the death of Bob Rogers, an elderly man who had been the victim of repeated robberies. They had evidence, fingerprints, and a muddy shoe print. Lieutenant Headley readied the next plan of attack. He knew the strong evidence in the case would ultimately help him convict the right suspect. Emmett police organized a task force to brainstorm leads in the brutal murder. And they made a shocking discovery.
Apparently, Mr.
They learned Sharon Zachary had power of attorney over Bob Rogers' finances.
Yes, I did. I contacted Tony.
Since she was the one who found his body and had unlimited access to his house, they needed to eliminate her as a suspect.
Still valid.
They obtained a search warrant and began to look into her affairs.
We started talking to family members, and as a result, we started looking at her a little closer as a possible suspect.
Their first stop was to return to the crime scene. Thousands of dollars were found in the house, cash stashed in every room. Investigators removed files and records from Rogers' home. In poring over his records, Lieutenants Geigel and Headley learned Sharon Zachary was using Rogers' credit cards.
Same thing here as some
Detectives began to suspect their hunch about Sharon Zachary had been right.
We also pulled bank account statements, discovered that she had been actually withdrawing some funds from some of his bank account. So that kind of led us into motive a little bit, that there might be more to this and that there might be some money that may be at issue.
I handle all of his legal and financial matters. As a matter of fact, he was in here.
For further insight into Rogers' finances, they decided to question his lawyer.
Power of attorney to a Sharon Zachary.
Rogers' lawyer explained Zachary was granted power of attorney 4 months before the murder. But just 2 weeks before being found dead, the elderly man had abruptly changed his mind. He discovered $10,000 missing from one of his accounts, and he was furious.
The case further developed when we learned that Mr. Rogers had made a will leaving the property that belongs to him to Sharon Zachary upon his death.
With a motive clearly in place, Lieutenants Geigel and Headley sent an investigator to Rogers' bank. The bank manager said Sharon Zachary came in with Bob Rogers about a year before his death, asking to be put on his account. Rogers sat by uncomfortably while the paperwork was completed. But he returned alone the next day, requesting she be removed from the account.
He wanted her removed as the power of attorney. He wanted to handle his own affairs as he didn't trust Sharon Zachary any longer.
Mr. Rogers hadn't been able to get to his will yet. He was unfortunately murdered before he was able to do that.
Finally, detectives spoke to a security guard at a local discount store. Zachary went to buy some shoes and attempted to use Bob Rogers' credit card. When the card was declined, security was summoned to the counter. They called Rogers at his house, and he told them that under no circumstances did he give Zachary permission to use his credit card. She insisted there was a mix-up.
The significance of this card was that it caused Mr. Rogers to become suspicious, because at that time he would have felt that he was being cheated by Sharon Zachary.
It was a huge break in the case. Detectives Geigel and Headley had confirmation that Sharon Zachary was desperately trying to take advantage of 81-year-old Bob Rogers. They were becoming more and more convinced that it was Zachary who killed the elderly man in a fit of greed. But they needed proof. If they could find a way to directly prove her guilt, the detectives knew they had found their murderer.
Take a look at what you got.
Lieutenant Geigel and Lieutenant Headley were hot on the trail of the murderer of 81-year-old Bob Rogers.
Hey, what do you got?
The man was bludgeoned to death in his own home, and preliminary evidence was pointing to the guilt of his caretaker, Sharon Zachary.
Yeah, it looks like she may have signed his name.
Zachary had been taking advantage of her power of attorney over Rogers' finances. It seemed clear the old man didn't appreciate Zachary spending his money.
We were trying to find anything that would link Zachary into any kind of financial wrongdoing, anything that we could find to help try to kind of piece everything together. Plus, we still had not found a murder weapon.
Then, another discovery. Lieutenant Headley learned Zachary had tried to get the plans to Rogers' land. They studied Bob Rogers' land plot. They wondered why Sharon Zachary, who rented one of Rogers' homes, would request a copy of Rogers' property plan. What they noticed immediately was the amount of water on Rogers' property. They knew one of the ponds would be the perfect place to stash a murder weapon.
There were 3 ponds that were adjacent to the house of Mr. Rogers, and we thought that possibly that they were used to hide the murder weapon. It is also interesting that there's a worn-down trail that leads from this area of the 3rd pond behind Mr. Rogers' house to the house where Sharon Zachary lived.
Divers were dispatched to check the pond, and the detective's instinct paid off. The divers pulled a 3-foot section of pipe from the water. At the crime lab, forensic scientists examined the pipe. Although a long shot, there could still be blood evidence on the pipe. Forensic scientist Marjorie Harris.
You have pores and crevices and cracks that allow the blood actually to soak into the weapon itself, or dents. If you have cracks and crevices in a metal object, you still have pockets where the blood can accumulate and actually dry and adhere to those surfaces.
Despite the fact the pipe had been submerged in the pond, it still had remains of human blood.
I was very glad that we found it. I don't believe this has ever happened before, that a murder weapon like this could be retrieved being submerged in water and still have viable DNA that could be identified.
Forensic investigators replicated the blood spatter of the crime scene. Using a pipe similar to the one found in the pond, they struck a melon to simulate a skull. Comparing crime scene photos to the crime reconstruction, forensic investigators concluded the pipe pulled from the pond was the same pipe used to kill Bob Rogers.
We like to do a crime scene reconstruction where we can tell a series or a sequence of events. What happened, where did it happen, what was the order that it happened.
The detectives felt they finally had all the ammunition they needed to go after Sharon Zachary. With a search warrant in hand, they entered her house.
By seizing the financial records in Sharon Zachary's house, it shows that she had an interest in the finances of Mr. Rogers, and that she wanted to know, apparently, more about what kind of money that he had available to him.
Sharon Zachary was cooperative in allowing police to remove Bob Rogers' records from her house.
I have a pair of white shoes and stuff.
Okay.
The officers asked her for a pair of tennis shoes for comparison to a shoe print found at the crime scene. Without any argument, she produced a pair of white tennis shoes, which they promptly bagged for testing. Back at the crime lab, treads on Sharon Zachary's tennis shoes were compared with the footprints found on the broken glass at the murder scene. Although she insisted she never went in the house that morning, the preserved prints matched those of Sharon Zachary's perfectly.
The individual characteristics are exactly the same. Therefore, the impression from your crime scene and the impression made by the known shoe from the suspect are one and the same.
The shoe print was enough to arrest Sharon Zachary. It definitively placed her at the scene of the crime. The woman who claimed to be Bob Rogers' caregiver was now being arrested for his murder.
We believe that the forensic evidence that we located clearly established that she was at the crime scene. We established that Sharon Zachary was untruthful, and we believe that Sharon Zachary murdered Mr. Rogers.
Back at the crime lab, forensic scientists were comparing a fingerprint found on Bob Rogers' belt with Zachary's prints. It was a perfect match.
We actually physically found Zachary's print on the back of Mr. Rogers' belt, which shows that she had contact with the body. That didn't match with what she initially had told our officers.
Zachary said it was only natural they had evidence linking her to the crime scene. She said she spent so much time taking care of the old man that it was not surprising her print would be on his belt. But forensics told a different story about the print.
It is very fragile in nature and in all likelihood would have been destroyed in simply placing the belt through the belt loops and attaching it to the pants. If it has been on a person's clothing for a period of time, it's not likely that either the victim's print or a suspect print would be present on the underside of that belt.
It was too late for Sharon Zachary. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and everything was pointing to her guilt.
The forensic evidence that we gathered at the scene of this incident were key into solving this crime. Everything from the thumbprint to the shoe impressions that were pulled to the murder weapon that we eventually found submerged in one of the ponds. That pulled everything together, made all the pieces fit, and allowed us to solve this homicide.
Sharon Zachary could no longer hide from what detectives were able to piece together. Angered by not being able to freely spend Rogers' money, Sharon Zachary let greed get the better of her.
Keep looking.
On the morning of April 26th, she went over to his house. While he was stashing away some of his cash, she struck the elderly man repeatedly with a pipe.
I think she finally saw an opportunity to take him out of the picture, collect all of his estate, and walk away scot-free.
She rifled through Rogers' pockets, turning them inside out and removing the cash.
My guess is that she knew exactly what she was going to do when she went over there. She knew, based on his history of the robberies and the prior assaults on Mr. Rogers, that she was going to make it look exactly like that.
Attempting to make the premeditated killing look like a random robbery, she then went outside and smashed the sliding glass door.
Mr. Robert Rogers. Officer, would you take...
And after she did it, she tried to make the place look like your typical textbook breaking and entering. But she forgot a couple key facts. And I think that was her ultimate downfall.
Lieutenants Headley and Geigel's strong detective work held up in court. Sharon Zachary was found guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Some are victims of circumstance, killed for being at the wrong place at the absolute wrong time. Others are exactly where they belong, but remain unsafe from killers who seek them out with a motive of raw greed.